Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. As Lance said, this is the third season of these webinars, and I hope that they've been useful for you if you've been to them before. And if you haven't, you'll kind of see how this goes. I put a lot of work into getting these handouts ready, and I hope they're useful for everybody. And basically, the webinar is just kind of going through those and helping you understand what I have there. So really, if you have any questions as we're going along, please put them in the chat. Lance will bring them to my attention. We'll go ahead and deal with them as we're going there. And again, there'll be time at the end to ask questions too. So I'm going to go ahead, I guess, and share my screen and get started. All right, should be able to see my screen there now, right? So we have a good, I think, selection. There's going to be 6 of them. This is the first of 6. And so we're looking at, of course, this is the 3rd season too. So maybe it's a little bit harder to find topics, I suppose. But we did a survey, I think it was the 2nd year, and got a lot of good feedback from people who'd been joining us on these, and basically just have responded to the, I guess, the more sought after topics, the topics that got the most votes. And so this is a group, the wild lettuce and rattlesnake root species, Lactuca and Prenanthes, that pretty commonly found, and there is some challenge in identifying them, certainly. So we're going to take a look at that this evening. And if you've never been to one of these before, this is how I start out, basically, with the sort of the brochure or the website page that Lance puts up there for people to see when they look at these and register. And then, obviously, I use a lot of images and photos. And if it weren't for the tremendous resource that the internet has for those kinds of photos and images, it wouldn't be so easy to do this, because although I'd like to have the ability and the time to take these pictures myself, maybe someday I will, I don't have that kind of time. So I use images from the internet extensively, and I certainly want to give credit to these sources that you see right here. I use mainly cow photos, Minnesota wildflowers, Missouri plants. Those are the top 3 for sure. So we're looking at this group of Asteraceae. And I tried to start out at a level that was welcoming to everybody, certainly. It helps if you had a little bit of background in plants. Lots of terminology here, and if you don't understand a term, please ask. That's what I use. This is the language that we use to talk about these things. So that's what we have to do. So if you know something about the Asteraceae, of course, you know that the common name or asters and sunflowers, very, very important group. Either the second or the first. I think it's actually the second most diverse family. Orchids are first. And by the way, we're going to be talking about those too in a few weeks. But so the most important thing about Asteraceae is the inflorescence, the type of arrangement that the flowers are in. And it's called a head or capitulum, as you can see here. And this diagram you see here is one that we use just to show sort of the generic situation in most Asteraceae. This would be what you'd see in an aster or a sunflower. You'd have this inflorescence here, which is, again, an inflorescence is a group of flowers. This is a whole bunch of flowers here. Some of them are called ray flowers or ray florets. I'm going to see if I can find my pointer here. Some of them are called ray florets, and some are called disc florets because of the different structure in them. But not all Asteraceae have this 2-flowered component to their head. There's actually 4 different ways the flowers in Asteraceae can present themselves in a capitulum. And again, the first one is this one right here. Again, it's called a radiate head. It does have both disc flowers and ray flowers, both combined. But if you're looking at a blazing star, for example, you would see an inflorescence that just has disc flowers. There are no ray flowers. Or if you're looking at an inflorescence of everlasting in the genus Nephallium, it's got both little filiform florets and it's got some disc florets. But what we're looking at tonight is this fourth type of inflorescence or capitulum. That's called a ligulate head or liguliflorous head, in which the type of flower is just one, and it looks a little bit like this ray floret over here, but it's different, and so it's formed in a different way. The ray florets over here are formed from 3 petals. You can see that because there's 3 lobes right here. So it had a 5-petaled corolla at one time, but through reduction, 2 of those petals were lost, and we have 3 petals left that become fused together to form this structure. Over here in the ligulate flower or floret, you'll see this very easily in some pictures, but this is formed from 5 petals. All 5 petals that were originally present in this family, they're all fused together into this one structure called a ligule, and hence the name of it there. So that's an important part of what we'll be seeing and learning about in this group. Another thing that's very important in the Asteraceae is this thing called the involucre. The involucre is a series of greenish, sometimes somewhat colored bracts, or a bract is basically a very, very reduced modified leaf. And there's a whole bunch of these bracts usually present in this structure called an involucre that sits right below the, in this case, the ligulate flowers. And that's because this is a Lactuca, one of our species we're going to be looking at here. This is blue lettuce. Or in this Asteraceae here, this is New England aster, the involucre, these bracts right through here, and they're sitting right below the ray flowers. It's a series again. It can be in sort of different forms and different shapes, and there can be different numbers of these bracts, but the collective group of all of those bracts is the involucre. And then the third thing that's important to understand about Asteraceae is these 2 things here that have to do with the fruit and this thing called a pappus. So the pappus is what becomes of, in other flowers, normal flowers you might say, are the sepals. And the sepals of a regular flower, like a rose or something, are kind of like these bracts. They're small reduced leaves that usually occur in groups of 5 or 4, usually the same number as petals, and they sit right below the petals. In the Asteraceae, the sepals are highly modified. Calyx is a term we use to describe the entire group of them. And so in the Asteraceae, the sepals have become modified to form this structure called a pappus. And we're seeing examples of what this pappus looks like. These right here are just simple bristles. These right here are plumose bristles. They're kind of feather-like. These are scales, fringed scales. D right here has some very short, reduced scales. E is showing some scales that are deciduous, meaning that they're going to come off. F is showing pappus that's made up of awns with little barbs pointing downward on them. And G is an example of a pappus that's not there. It doesn't have one. The other thing that's in this picture, these things right here that I'm outlining in blue, that's the fruit. So the fruit is sitting right underneath the pappus. Sometimes there's a beak, and we're going to see that in today's group. Sometimes there's a beak that separates the fruit from the pappus up here, this long, slender thread right here. The fruit in the Asteraceae is called a cypsela. In the older days, when I first learned about Asteraceae, we called them achenes. And they are essentially a type of achene, so saying they're achenes isn't totally wrong, but Cypsela is the correct term that we use now for them. So a Cypsela is like an achene, and it's dry, doesn't have any flesh, it's indehiscent, meaning it doesn't open up on its own. It's only got one seed in the fruit. Each fruit only contains one seed. And that seed is separate from the wall of the fruit. So you can actually, if you broke open the fruit, you could get the seed out. It's not fused to the seed, as in corn, for example. But the thing that makes this a specialized achene is that it's formed from an inferior ovary. And we can see that basically here because remember, the ovary is what forms the fruit. This fruit is a mature ovary. All of these fruits are. And the ovary sits below what was or is a modified calyx. So anytime the ovary is sitting below the other flower parts, the calyx, the petals, the stamens, for example, all the other parts of a flower, if the ovary is sitting down below those things, then the position of it is inferior. Any questions? Okay, so let's take a look at this tribe. So the term tribe is a taxonomic level that sits between the level of family and genus. In big families like Asteraceae with just huge number of species, huge number of genera, it's very helpful to have these extra taxonomic levels in here, such as a tribe, to help organize all of the genera into smaller groups. So Cichorieae is the name of the tribe that we're dealing with here. And there's 6 characteristics that are important for it. And the first one you see here is a really good one, because this really helps us separate out these species from all the rest of the Asteraceae, is that they have milky sap. And it can be different colors, as we'll see tonight. Dandelions right there have a white sap. And again, this is the sap. So this is the sugary material, the food material that is conducted through the phloem. So the other thing, of course, is what we just got done talking about. The flowers are ligulate. They have that corolla. Corolla is a term for the collective petals, all the petals as a group, 5 fused petals. And again, we can see that here in this picture here, showing what a ligulate head looks like. All of these are ligulate flowers. And again, the corolla is this yellow portion that I just filled in there. Now again, this type of flower is what then defines what the capitula is in this group as well, being a ligulate or liguliflorous type of flower head. Remember, the term capitula is an inflorescence type. It's a term for the way that the flowers are arranged. The phyllaries, or the bracts, so that's a fancy term for those involucral bracts that we were looking at before. In this group, in the Cichorieae, there's usually one series of long, uniform bracts. It's the inner series, and what that means is it's the highest up. Again, when you look at an involucre, if there's series, meaning that there's rows of them, there's different rows. They go from the bottom towards the top. And as you go from the bottom towards the top, the more bottom ones sort of overlap the ones right above it. And that continues up. And so the most inner ones are the ones that are further to the top. So we see in this example here of skeleton plant, the involucral bracts right here. There's this one that's really long right here. That's the one that's further to the inside. And then there's usually, in some cases, none. That's what this 0 here in parentheses mean. But most often, one or more additional bracts or phyllaries that are further to the outside, and they're shorter. We can see some right here at the very base, right down through here. The subsella, the fruit, is either angled, which means it has sort of a three-dimensional aspect to it, and it's got like a five-sided shape or a four-sided shape or a six-sided shape, or it's really very flattened. And sometimes, again, it has that structure that I pointed out to you before, that is a slender, filiform, thread-like extension or separation between the fruit, the subsella, and the pappus, which we call a beak. This is Cichorieae over here. This is false dandelions, the native species in Iowa. And here again, we can see the brown things here are the fruits. And then the capillary bristles, these bristle-like structures here at the top, are the pappus. So in this tribe, in the Tribe Cichorieae, the pappus is always very persistent. It stays present, doesn't fall off, and it's usually made up of these capillary bristles, which are just slender threads. But there's usually a lot of them. Okay, so the Cichorieae in Iowa, what do we have in Iowa in this tribe? Well, we have these genera right here. There are 7 genera right there. And tonight we're going to be focused again on Lactuca. So this, just a word of explanation real quick. The title is Lactuca and Prenanthes. Well, where does Mogidium come in then? Well, you'll learn just a little bit. That's a new genus for previously a species that was a Lactuca. So we're using the original sort of nomenclature in Eilers and Russa, for example. Then we need to include this species here too. So we're going to be looking at Lactuca, Prenanthes, and Mogidium. The other ones, North Ocala, that's the prairie dandelion. Cichorieae, as I said, is false or dwarf dandelions. Ligodesmia, that's this thing right here, skeleton plant. And then there's another genus, Asteraceae, and those are the hawkweeds. Total of 17 native species among these 7 genera here. This tells you that the Cichorieae in general are somewhat of a weedy tribe, because if you look at the non-native species of Cichorieae in Iowa, we have a lot more. Well, we have 2 more species, but we have a lot more genera. Here we got what, 6 + 5, 11 genera right there. And so Cichorium, that's Cichorieae. Crepus is called hawksbeard. Cichorieae, again, we've got 2 native and 1 non-native. Hyraceae, hawkweed, 3 native, 2 non-native. There's a couple of non-native Lactucas we're going to be looking at. Leontodon, that is called fall dandelion. Picris is called oxtongue. Pyropappus, that's called false dandelion. Sonchus is sow thistle. Traxicum is our friendly dandelion that grows out in our yards, of course. And Trigopogon is goat's beard. Okay, I'm going to take a look now at the other part of the handout. So I'm going to bounce out of this for a second and pull up. Oops, that's not the right one. Nope, that's not the right thing. Sorry, there we go. This handout right here. So I put this together because this is a good summary of some of the ecology and biogeography of the species that we're dealing with. And I want people to know what the Iowa biogeography is, just in case it's not. It may be true for some of these species, certainly, at least some of the Prenanthes. If you wanted to include these in a seed mix, for example, a prairie seed mix, or if you were doing some woodland restoration, then it's very important that you know what the Iowa biogeography is, because not every species that's native to Iowa is native to every county. In fact, the far highest majority of plants are not native to every county. Take Lactuca biennis, for example. our first one right here. So what you see in these columns here, Flora of North America taxonomy, and then Eilers of Rusa. Excuse me, Eilers and Rusa. This is the checklist of Iowa vascular plants. It's what we've got for a checklist of plants in Iowa. It's badly out of date. So that's why it's important to sort of update the nomenclature to what I think should be our standard nomenclature, of course, here, the huge monumental work called Flora of North America. And so if you look at Eilers and Rusa, and this is what that looks like. It's a book that looks like this, and I don't think it's in print anymore, but you can probably find it various places used. This plant, Lactuca biennis, will be listed in there as a species. It's called tall blue lettuce, and it's a native species to Iowa. Flora of North America agrees that's the same name, so nothing's happened to that taxon. That species uses the same name for it. This tells you again that it's native. And the Iowa coefficient of conservatism, these are the revised, they were revised in 2020, so I guess not newly, but recently revised coefficients of conservatism from the original list that came out in 2000. These have been updated, and the coefficients of conservatism are just a way of putting plants on a scale from 1 to 10 in terms of sort of what that species affinity is for very high quality, pristine environments. We use this as a way of assessing plant communities and ecosystems. You get a plant list, a list of species for a site. You can figure out what the average conservatism is, and that tells you something about sort of the quality of that site. So again, these are on a scale from 1 to 10. This one's a 4, which means it's sort of in the low medium range. The M, or the letters here, was something that the Flora of Iowa Working Group added to the revision, in which we are telling you what our confidence is, that this 4 is an accurate number. And so this is medium. We have just basically low, medium, and high. And the reason it's not high would be that, well, the people on the committee, the 7 of us collectively as a whole, we don't have a lot of experience with this species. We haven't seen it a lot, so we have to go just basically on vouchers in terms of what the habitats it has been found in are. That's one thing that would bring it down from a high to an M, most likely. The habitat is listed here, and this comes from a variety of sources, not just Eilers and Rusa, but I look at, you'll see the list of resources at the end of this, but I look at Missouri flora, Michigan flora, Nebraska flora, and kind of add to that. This then is the Iowa biogeography, as I was saying. This is a dot map. These dot maps come from 3 different sources, basically. This one comes from BONAP, which is what this map is right here, the Biota of North America program. And so what this is just basically the same thing you see right here, then this little yellow Iowa, but blown up so you can see it better, because that's really hard to see. This is the only source of information that's available, showing us what the distribution of this species is in Iowa. In some cases, we have a better source of that, the Iowa Prairie Plants book by Paul Christensen and Mark Mueller, in which Paul Christensen, who's of course deceased, but while he was alive, spent a lot of time looking at herbaria and vouchers and came up with these maps by looking at vouchers and determining again whether that was a voucher that is a good voucher in terms of using it to make this map. And so this is a better source, of course, because it does use Iowa data. The BONAP maps, they use Iowa data too, of course, but they will also use just anybody's species list that they get their hands on, which has resulted in certainly a few errors over the years there. So IPP is Iowa Prairie Plants, it's a little bit better. Now, the Lactuca canadensis obviously is a species that is statewide. It grows all across the state. Biennis, I put this red line in here to show that basically it looks like to me this is a species that does not occur really down through here. Now, you have to realize, of course, that when we see a map like this with a few counties that aren't red, it doesn't mean necessarily that Lactuca canadensis doesn't grow there. It just simply means we don't have a record of it there. It just simply hasn't been enough extensive collecting in every single county for there to be a voucher of all the species that are present in each county. But when you see a pattern like this, we can certainly assume that there are certainly populations of this species out here in these counties that aren't red. In Islers and Rosa, it does list the different varieties that are present, and so I do list those there. This one has a coefficient of 2, and we're really certain of it because we see this species a lot. This is the most common Lactuca that you're ever going to see, most likely. Floridana here, so now you're seeing, again, a variety here, and what you see over here now is, if it says equal, I'm telling you what a synonym is for that species. And other taxonomic treatments, Lactuca floridana, might go under a different name, Mogidium floridanum, and that's because some other taxonomists decided to call it that. They have their reasons for that. And we have to keep track then of the synonyms, so it makes more work for us, but that's what that means. Blue lettuce is the common name here. We see that this species is one that pretty much Iowa is as far north as it goes, and pretty much as far west as it goes too. We see that it really drops off here about Highway 20 or so, or Highway 30, I suppose, somewhere between there. A few records up further north, but over here we see that there's hardly anything up in Minnesota. So over here, just to make sure you're clear, the green here means it's present in the state, and then the light green means it's present in that county. Lactuca lodovinciana, this is prairie lettuce. This is a western species, as you can see here, and that's one reason for showing you the BONAP maps. That shows you the bigger context where these species occur across the United States, not just Iowa. That's very important to know. Where is a species relative to Iowa? This one has a couple of other synonyms. This is one I don't see very much of. It shows it being pretty common across northwest 2/3 of Iowa at least, but I've not run into it. We have a couple of non-native species here. That's shown by the blue over here in the BONAP maps. Saligna, willow leaf lettuce. Only one record for it, and I would say most likely, I don't know the nature of that record, of course. We could go look at a voucher at the herbarium and see what it is, but most likely I bet that, well, there's probably some other records perhaps haven't been reported, of course, so it might be present in some other places, but this is an example of a species that may not be present in the state anymore. It's hard to say for sure, but with only one known county, it's not. No, that's a possibility. We can see that it's really something that's further to our south and east. This is the most common non-native Lactuca, certainly, prickly lettuce. And again, it shows it over here as being present in every single county except for that one right there. And is it present in there? Of course it's present there. We just don't have a record for it. This is a native species of Asia and Europe. Oh, the other thing I'm putting over here in this first column also is the lifespan, as you can see here. Then we have the one that in flora of the checklist of Iowa plants in Islers and Rosa is Lactuca tatarica. It also goes by other names, Lactuca oblongifolia or Lactuca pulchella. Those are other synonyms that again use Lactuca as the genus. But now, according to Flora of North America, it's not in the Lactuca genus anymore, it's Mogidium. And one reason it might be moved out of Lactuca, it's very similar to Lactuca, and obviously it's going to look like one, certainly, but it's a perennial. And that may be enough of a reason to say that it's not closely enough related to Lactucas to be in that genus. All the other Lactucas here are either annuals or biennials. Then we have the 3 Prenanthes. They go by Nabalis as another older scientific name. Prenanthes albi, white rattlesnake root is a forest species, a woodland species, and you can kind of see it's, again, mainly to the north and east of us. And it's probably a little bit more common in the eastern 2/3 or eastern half of Iowa, using the Bonap map. The last two here are prairie species, and so they do have a map in Iowa prairie plants. And it's interesting to look at Prenanthes aspera here. When you look at the distribution in Bonap here, this is a pretty good example of just a few prairie species. There's not very many prairie species that have a distribution that looks like this, which is basically showing us that this species is pretty much endemic to tallgrass prairies. Yeah, there's a few populations out here, but these yellow ones here means it's very rare there. And so when we look at this distribution, it does sort of just hang right in the tallgrass prairie. Racemosa is one that, it kind of gets further out west here, of course, out in Colorado and Wyoming. It goes a little bit further east, it looks like, into Michigan a little bit there. It is one that, when you compare these two species, this one is definitely one that is more of a wet mesic to mesic prairie species. You see it more across northeast Iowa, whereas aspera is more of a mesic to dry mesic species. So that's what this is for, is to help you, again, just understand and learn more about these species, and again, more importantly, know which ones are native to your county. Okay, now we're going to go back to the PowerPoint and take a look at these species now. All right, so the first thing we see here next is a little table I put together to help you see again the difference between these three genera: Lactuca, Prenanthes, and Mogideum. And the most important thing to separate these two, and especially to separate what were the Lactucas, Mogideum and Lactuca, of course, from the others, from the Prenanthes, is what you see here on this first row here, which is the size and the shape of the fruit, the sepsella. In Lactuca, there are always these very, very flat sepsella, or again, the term akene is sometimes used. It's these brown things right here. Very flat, very flat. So they have kind of an oblong or elliptic shape, but they're very flat and very compressed. There usually is a beak. In this one here, canadensis, we can see a beak right here. This thread-like structure right here. Right here, we can see a little bit of a pappus here. In some of them, it's not much of a beak, and we'll see that in Lactuca floridana and Lactuca biennis, for example. But in the other ones, the yellow flowered Lactuca, like canadensis, it's definitely very distinct, and there's no question that it's there. A beak of 2 to 6 millimeters. In Prenanthes, the sepsella is not flat at all. It's more of a cylindric, columnar kind of shape structure. It's very oblong, it's 4 to 5 angled, and there's no beak at all. You can see the pappus joining the top of the fruit right here directly. Whereas again, over here, the pappus and the akene are separated by the beak. The beak basically is the beak is sort of like an extension off the top of the fruit to elevate the pappus up higher. What do you suppose the pappus is used for in these plants? Well, it's used for seed dispersal, of course, the seeds that are inside these fruits. So Mogideum is, again, formerly a Lactuca, somewhat similar to these over here. It's not nearly quite as flat, though, as you can see here. There is some compression there, but it's not nearly as flat and then compressed as we see here. And there is a little bit of a beak, but it's a much more stout beak. It's not nearly as slender as these over here. Okay, another thing that's going to be important are the florets themselves, what the color is. And in Lactuca, there's 2 colors, basically. We've got 5 species that are yellow, and we've got 2 species that are bluish. In Prenanthes, the florets, and this is just the number of them here, which, there's quite a bit of range there, of course. All of these overlap some, so you really can't use number to help you very much. But definitely the color of Prenanthes are pretty unique. The Prenanthes are not typically colored the same as Lactuca or Mogideum. They're just creamy white in some, or more of a lavender. And for our species, at least, that's definitely true. Some other Prenanthes that we don't have can have yellow ligules, but we don't have that in any of ours, really. And then the Mogideum, which is called showy blue lettuce, they're this bright blue. All right, the next line is the pappus, as we can see here. And again, there are some differences here. In Lactuca, there can be anywhere from 40 to 120 of these bristles. All of them have barbulate bristles, and that just means all of these bristles have little tiny barbels, like on a fish hook, pointing downward. And you can't really see them very well unless you look at it with a scope. Maybe you can see them with a hand lens. So that's pretty much the same for all of them. The number of series, that's again the number of rows in which the bristles in the pappus are present. What we see here again is there is a difference between Lactuca and Prenanthes. Prenanthes are at the best dull white. There's usually some shading of yellowish or tan or orange brown coloration. They're not pure clean white. Lactuca are clean white, and also Mogideum are clean white. I couldn't find a good picture here, so I had to use this sketch from Flora of North America. But so the difference in color, again, Lactuca and Mogideum are pretty similar in terms of what the color of the pappus is, but Prenanthes again stands out as quite different. And then the last thing are the filaries themselves. In Lactuca, there's usually 5 to 13 filaries at least, in usually 3 to 5 series. We have this inner series again that's really long. It goes all the way from the base all the way to the top. But then there's some shorter ones in here. Here's another series here, another series here. So there's probably at least 3 series right here. In Prenanthes, there's really just one series. There's this long inner bract here, and that's it for the most part. So that's again, pretty good distinction. Now, I do have to tell you that, and this is something that varies, again, I think what I've seen, depending upon the floristic treatment you're using. I use Flora of North America. You see these little things right down here this would be the base, because these inflorescences, these heads are drooping downward. So this is at the base of the involucre. There's these little bract-like structures here. In Flora of North America, they interpret that to be an example of what's called the caliculi. Caliculi, it's like a type of calyx, basically. Little sepals that subtend the involucre. So those are caliculi. They're not involucral bracts. But I think some taxonomic treatments don't take that view or don't realize that they're caliculi, and they will call these reduced bracts. And that's the case, then Prenanthes has more than one series of bracts. But I think Flora of North America is right. These are not bracts. These are very, very small, tiny little structures like a calyx. And the term caliculi then is right. So there's only one filary here. Now, all of them have caliculi. And if you look real close over here, this one right here could be an example of one of those right there, rather than calling that a bract. In Mogideum and Lactuca, again, are very similar. This one and this one are pretty much the same. Again, we have usually 2 to 3 series of bracts here. But again, there are caliculi here too. Tiny little bracts that are down here at the base. So again, to summarize this, again, there's not much difference between Mogideum and Lactuca throughout most of this, but Prenanthes is always somewhat different. Okay, now the key basically to help you figure out these species. We don't have too many to work with here. So to key to genera, the first couplet right here is what you kind of suspect. It's kind of what I've been focusing on here with that table. It's going to separate out Prenanthes from Lactuca and Mogideum. This stuff right here is all for Lactuca and Mogideum, and this is all for Prenanthes. So again, this first character right here is the most important. Again, it's the shape of that fruit, flattened and compressed, sometimes with a very distinct beak, sometimes with a lesser distinct beak. Again, it's going to lead to these two. This up over here again, those subsella, circular in cross-section, 4 or 5 angled, never have a beak. That is going to lead to Prenanthes. If you can look at the fruits, then there's no question which direction to go here. Now, the rest of these things are always, a little bit less helpful, but they're pretty good. There is some difference in the length to width ratio of the leaves, the calling leaves, the leaves that are on the middle part of the stem, looking at just the blades here. What this is saying here for Lactuca and Mogideum, I'll go ahead and put those two genera in here. These leaves over here are usually quite a bit longer than they are broad, over 3 times as long as broad. So like this is 4 to 20 times longer than broad, whereas Prenanthes usually more in the range of just 1 to 3 times as long as broad, and not quite as lobed. There's lobing over here, but not quite as much lobing. Sometimes when you do have lobing, it's more like palmate lobing, which means that the lobes are kind of in the shape of a palm rather than a feather. Pinnate means like a feather. The lobes are coming off like the veins come off of a feather. So lobing is usually more pronounced in Lactuca and Mogideum and less pronounced in Prenanthes. If you just have the plant without any flowers, there is a difference in the pappus, as I pointed out. And again, there is a difference in the involucres. Now, how do we separate then Lactuca from Mogideum? I've been saying that they're very similar. They certainly are. They used to be in the same genus. Well, one thing that separates them is the fact that Lactuca are annuals or biennials, and Mogideum is a perennial. So that's always a little, I don't like that characteristic in keys, because how do you know for sure what the lifespan is? You could pull up on the roots, I suppose, and just, try to determine it that way, but that's not easy. So it's important to realize that is a difference here, but it's not the best diagnostic one. The best diagnostic one is this first one, which just basically is the leaves, looking at the leaves here, the middle and upper stem leaves. In Lactucas, they're always going to be mostly have some teeth or lobing on them, whereas in Mogideum, they're usually not lobed that much. Another common name for, again, showy blue lettuce from Mogideum here is Lactuca oblongifolia, and that is a reference to sort of the oblong-shaped leaves that you're going to see here. Here's some pictures of Mogideum, and this is a really good example of typically what the leaves look like. There's no lobing in these leaves. They're pretty narrow and very, again, much longer than they are wide, which again is very important up here, but mostly unlobed. Now, can they have lobes? Yes. Things aren't easy in botany. Here's a picture of of Mogideum that does have some lobing, and I've seen it with some lobing, but it's always very minor, and it's usually on some of the lower leaves. So that usually is pretty helpful in terms of separating out Mogideum from Lactuca. Here's a few pictures of the flowers. Now, again, for most of the Lactucas, the fact that this is a blue, the corollas are blue here, is very helpful, because most of our Lactucas, especially the ones that you might find in the same kind of prairie environment, are usually yellow. Okay, so now we're going to look at those other Lactuca here. So, excuse me, we're going to look at the Lactuca. So let me back up. So this just got us to Lactuca, separate Lactuca from Ogygium. Now we're going to look at Lactuca, I should say, and separate the Lactuca into two groups. And this is basically on the basis of the color of the corollas. These have bluish to bluish white ligules. Those again, that fused, those 5 corolla lobes that are fused together is what a ligule is. These have yellow, generally speaking. Now, again, you can look at the beak too. The beak on these over here, and these are the 2 species of again, blue flowered ones, Biennis and Floridana. They have beaks, but they're very indistinct beaks. I mean, it's almost like they don't really quite even have beaks. Very, very short, if at all. Whereas these over here, the yellow flowered ones, have a very distinct beak. And you'll see that again in some pictures of the achenes or fruits here. Okay, so we separate out the blue ones from the yellow ones. There's 2 species here. There's 5 species here. We're going to deal with the yellow ones a little bit later. Now we're going to look at the blue ones here. How do you separate out Biennis and Floridana? They're both called blue lettuce. This one's called tall blue lettuce. This one's called blue lettuce. It'll be on the next slide, pictures of it. It's basically the best is probably the pappus. Yeah, there are some difference in the number of florets here, but there's some overlap there. There's more florets basically over here, fewer florets. How do you know the number of florets? Well, you count the number of ligules. The ligules are easy to see. If you just count those, you're counting then the number of florets present in one head. But the pappus is usually better. The pappus in Biennis is more of a brownish gray. Here is an achene with some pappus showing here. And there is a brownish, reddish brownish coloration in the pappus here. And here again, we can see that there's not much of a beak here. Not much of a beak at all. And that's going to be true again for both of these species here. The secondary inflorescence. So the primary inflorescence is the capitulum. It's the head. Again, this thing right here. Because all of these are, there's probably about 20 ligulate flowers right here. They're all arranged in this ligulate head. How are these ligulate heads arranged is the secondary one. And here's an example of what it looks like. And so this says secondary inflorescence very crowded. And that's pretty good. That's pretty true, the way this looks right here. And to some extent, this one right here. In Floridana, the secondary inflorescence is supposed to be more open. Well, this shows the vegetative aspects. Here's the leaves, a lot of lobing going on there, and really very deep lobes. These lobes are, the sinuses are cut right down to the midline of the leaf here for the most part. So this is Biennis. These are pictures of Floridana. And true to form, this inflorescence looks more open. The capitula are more spread out. The leaves are somewhat similar. You know, again, the leaves are going to be similar. It's going to be hard to tell species apart just on the basis of leaves. But here again, you can see the pappus. The pappus here is nice and white. And again, the cypsela here, not much of a beak at all here. One thing that is true, and I don't know if, well, it doesn't help separate them, but it does help separate them from the yellow ones, I think, to some extent maybe. Or maybe it's just for Lactuca versus Ogygium. But you see these bracts here have some purplish coloration at the top of these bracts or filaries. Some pubescence on the underside of the leaves of Floridana. That's what this is showing here, some hairs there. All right, now let's look at the yellow ones. The yellow ones are that group right there. You saw those names right here. And to separate the yellow ones, now we're going to separate those into two groups. That's on the basis of the achenes. And the two groups are looking at the Sipsella, the achenes, again, are the fruits, and how many nerves, basically lines, are on the face of those achenes, those Sipsellae. 1, maybe up to 3 in some cases, but normally just 1. Over here, the Sipsella faces have 5 to 7. Could be as high as 9, but 5 to 7. And the way this works out is that these two species are non-native, Prickly lettuce and willow leaf lettuce, Seriola and Saligna, and these two, Canadensis and Lutevinciana, are native. So the two native ones have the fruits with just one nerve. And how do we separate Canadensis, which is really very, very common, from Lutevinciana, the prey lettuce, which is not nearly as common? It's the size of the involucre. It's the size of those capitula, those heads. 7 to 10 millimeters, as you can see here for Lactuca canadensis. That's when it's in flowering. They will get a little bit bigger in fruit. So in fruit, it's like 10 to 15. For Lutevinciana, not much overlap. In flower, 10 does not overlap with 12. Much larger involucres here, 12 to 20 when it's in flower, 15 to 23 when it's in fruit. So Lutevinciana will be on the next slide. Canadensis is by far the most common native lettuce that you will see in Iowa. It's the one I see just all the time. Here's some pictures of it. It's a common species in a variety of environments. Usually they're grassland type environments, maybe some disturbance. The leaves do have little auricles, these little flaps or ear-like structures that come off the base of the leaf here and kind of wrap around the stem a little bit, but several of them have that. So it's not uniquely something that's found just on Canadensis. Here's what the leaves look like. Here's some of the flower shots. Nice yellow ligules. Here's the involucre. And here's that achene, or the Sipsella. Again, very distinct beaks here. Again, remember the beaks on Lactuca floridana and Lactuca biennis, hardly existent. Of course, again, they have bluish coloration here. So again, you can use color there to separate them. Here's a look at the pappus. Now here's an important one. The sap, the colored sap, the latex on Canadensis has got a very definite brownish, tannish look to it. And I mention it because the species that you will have the most problem confusing with this is the non-native prickly lettuce, because those are the two most common species. And they look somewhat similar, just leaf-like, and they have yellow ligules, so flower color is the same. But if you don't have, the flowers won't help you. Basically, the fruits might, because the beak on prickly lettuce is even taller than this. But if you just look at the sap on prickly lettuce is pure white. And again, the sap here on Canadensis is tainted a little bit brownish. So this is Canadensis. Lutevinciana is just a bigger version, basically, of Canadensis for the most part. However, as we can see right here, Lutevinciana can have more variation in the color of the corollas. The ligules can be more of a bluish lavender. Flora of North America says that they are usually yellow, sometimes bluish. This picture came from Minnesota Wildflowers, and Minnesota Wildflowers says that up in Minnesota, apparently, they see blue flowers more often than yellow, I guess. You can kind of see the involucre here, just, it's not side-by-side comparison, but this looks, to me, it looks bigger, again, than the one we saw here. That's an important characteristic, again, that separates them right here. I suppose if you saw one that was bluish in color, and everything else kind of matched up, that might help you separate it. But these are pretty big, robust plants. Here again is that filiform, very thread-like beak, white pappus. This looks a little bit like prickly lettuce right here, the mid-vein of the leaf here on the bottom side having some hairs. I would call these hairs, though. On prickly lettuce, they are actually prickles. They're much more stout, as you're going to see in just a little bit. So that's what's left here to look at the other two yellow ones here, the two non-native ones. We'll do that quick here, and then we'll look at the three Prenanthes. So the two, again, we separated these out back. Let me go back, I guess, to this one right here. These, again, the two non-native ones are going to have cypsella with many more nerves on their face. You'll see that in just a bit right here. So to separate Sigligna from Cereola, this one is not very common. Remember, this is the one there's only one record for it down in southwest Iowa, so it's even questionable whether it's even in the state anymore. But willow leaf lettuce is the common name for it, and it has very narrow leaves, as you can see right here. And I think its ligules are a little bit more pale yellow, basically. And that's what's used here to separate it, is the linear lancelet leaves, 12 to 30 times as long as broad, not much lobing on any of them at all. No prickles really of any kind on the leaves. That's in contrast to prickly lettuce, which has lots of prickles coming off the mid vein on the underside of the leaf. It has prickles coming off the leaf margins. And these are pretty stout hairs. A prickle is a prickle is a modified hair, but it's modified to be very tough and rigid and stiff and sharp. And that's a good description of what we have here. These leaves are a lot more lobed too. So that's the difference between prickly lettuce and Sigligna. And again, this one is very, very common one. And again, this one, to separate it from wild yellow lettuce, Lactuca canadensis, which is going to look a lot like. You could use the achenes. See these achenes down here? They have lots of lines on them. Those lines we can see there, and you could blow this up if you just make your picture larger on the PDF you have. But you can see there's a lot more nerves on these. A nerve is basically a line. It's like a vein in a sense. A lot more of them here. So that would separate it from Lactuca canadensis, because Lactuca canadensis, remember, we'll go back here, it just has one. There's a vein. No, this is lutevinciana, but here we go. One nerve right there. And that's what lutevinciana has too. One nerve right there, right in the middle. Whereas these guys have lots and lots of nerves on them. And again, the sap on this one is pure white. All right, the last three here, and we're just at our time's end here, but we'll finish up just a bit here. Prenanthes, the rattlesnake roots. And so there's three species, again, in Iowa, as we saw in the handout there. And they separate out basically the two prairie species over here and the woodland forest species over here on the basis of those involucral bracts. Very smooth, no hairs whatsoever. Glabrous means no hairs on the involucral bracts for Prenanthes alba. These guys over here have very pubescent bracts. You'll see that in the pictures coming up. And then to separate Aspera from racemosa is basically, again, on the basis of pubescence. Aspera means hairy. And so if the stems and lower leaves are pubescent and the ligules are more cream color, that's Aspera. Instead, if the stems and lower leaves are more glabrous and the ligules more pink to lavender, have more of a pinkish look to them, racemosa. Now, it's going to be very important that you look at the stem below the inflorescence here. Racemosa up in the inflorescence is hairy. You have to get down below the inflorescence where the leaves are in the lower part of the stem and look at that part. All right, so I'm going to show you some pictures of Prenanthes alba right here. This is the big white rattlesnake root that again grows in our woodlands, forest environments. Big leaves on it. A lot of the leaves have this pinnate lobing. They have the 3 lobes here, which is more of a palmate. Excuse me, I said pinnate, more of a palmate type of lobing. But not always. These don't have those lobes nearly as much as these do. Here again are the heads, and you can see the involucral bracts here, very smooth, no pubescence whatsoever. Again, that single long filiary, which is again characteristic of Prenanthes. Alba has very reddish brown pappus. That's what we're seeing here. The other 2, which are again our prairie species, Aspera. Here you can see all kinds of pubescence on the filaries here. No problem seeing that. You don't even need a hand lens to see that. And now the lower stems, there's pubescence on this, and there's pubescence on the underside of this leaf. So when it's got a lot of pubescence that's down below the lower part of it, no, don't look at this part of the plant. You gotta look down here on the lower stem, look at the undersides of these leaves. If you see pubescence, then it's Aspera. Here's a picture of closer up of a ligulate flower head here. The whitish cream color flowers. Here's a picture of what the Cypsela, again, remember Prenanthes has the more cylindrical columnar type of Cypsela. And one that's all done, and this is one that the Cypsela has already been dispersed. And then our last one is Racemosa. Here again, look at this lower stem, glabrous. Down in this lower stem, glabrous. No pubescence. This is a leaf coming off the lower part of the stem here. Not much lobing again in these Prenanthes. The Prenanthes don't have as much lobing as the Lactucas. But again, if you look at where the flowers are up here, there's some pubescence on the stem up here. So you can't be using the stem up here to look for pubescence. You got to be looking at the lower part of the stem. Here's a picture of the involucral bracts again, very pubescent, much different than Prenanthes alba. And that's it. We've gone through what you need to know to identify Prenanthes, Lactuca, and Mogideum. Questions, I guess.
So far right now in the chat, we just have one question or comment. It says, I have some trouble telling when an ovary becomes a fruit, becomes a seed, as in what is an insect feeding on in and among the flowers?
Well, let me point out something here. I think it was in this one right here. Nope, right here. Look at that right there. Anyone know what that is? You can unmute now and talk. What's that?
Spider?
That's a crab spider. And they sit in the flowers and they wait to ambush pollinators. So the question is, how do you tell when an ovary becomes a fruit, becomes a seed?
Yeah.
That's the question. That's a good question. So the ovary, it's going to depend on what kind of fruit the plant has to some extent. There's 2 basic different kinds of fruits, a dry fruit and a fleshy fruit. So when an ovary matures, that's the maturation part is what turns an ovary into a fruit. Ovaries are purely there for the place where the eggs are formed, for a sperm to fertilize, of course, to make a seed. When they're an ovary, the ovules are located there, and that's where the eggs are. So when that happens, of course, when fertilization, pollination happens, and then fertilization happens, remember that pollination and fertilization are not the same thing. Pollination happens first, and then perhaps fertilization will happen. The sperm actually fusing with an egg is what I'm talking about there. That's when sex happens, of course, and a zygote's formed, and you have the beginning of an embryo and a seed. At that point, now, when there's actually going to be seeds present, because that's happened, now hormones tell the plant to start developing a fruit. So that's the sequence there. It's functioning just as an ovary at first, but now if fertilization has happened and seeds are forming inside the ovary, now that ovary, to do its job, is going to have to turn into a fruit. And that may not change the way it looks very much if it's a dry fruit, because it doesn't change much in size. But if it's a fleshy fruit, it's going to change dramatically because much of the pericarp and other tissues in that ovary are going to expand and become fleshy and become like a berry or a plum or peach, which is another kind of fruit. There's different kinds of fleshy fruits. The seed is always still inside of that fruit. And of course, the whole point of the fruit is to disperse the seed. In most cases, I would say most plant species, the seed does not come out of the fruit until really after dispersal. It's the fruit that's used to disperse the seed in some way. That's not always true, because in some cases, fruits just open up and the seeds fall out, and then the seed has to get dispersed on its own somehow. That does happen too. But in most cases, the fruit is there to help that seed get dispersed.
Okay, we have a question of tips to distinguish between blue lettuce and chicory.
Oh, all right. Well, we don't have chicory, pictures up here. Let's go back to blue lettuce. So we've got two species here, Biennis and Floridana. So this is Biennis, this is Floridana. So, well, they're going to be similar because of the coloration, certainly. Chicory and blue lettuce have the same bluish color. Let me, there would be something, of course, let me just look real quick at my key here. Let's see. Because I do it by gestalt, and the fact that chicory is usually growing in a very disturbed place, growing along the roadside. But that is a good point. So let me see how it separates here, how Cichorium separates from the others real quick here. If I can find it real quick. Here we go. So I'm looking at Flora of Missouri here. It's the go-to floristic treatment. All right, so, okay. Well, this will make sense to you, I think. Now you know something about the structure of these and what a pappus is. So in order to, I'm looking at the key here, in order for me to get to Cichorium, which is chicory, I have to say that the pappus is absent, or it's formed only of scales. The pappus does not have those long thread-like capillary bristles that we saw so much, that we see right here. Right up here, for example, in Lactuca biennis, or these right here. Instead, if you remember that first slide, it's going to be completely not present. Let me go clear back to it. Or it's going to be some low scales probably. So if I go back to this slide, whoops, went too far. Right here. just little scales like this, or nothing at all, like this right here. So that would be, you'd have to have a flower. You'd have to take the flower apart a little bit, and a hand lens would be enough. Certainly, you might even be able to see it without a hand lens. You should be able to see it without a hand lens. But basically, does it look more like this? The pappus have just little scales, or not have any pappus at all, or does it have capillae bristles? That's what these are here.
Somebody asked if the scent is different with the chicory lettuce.
If the scent,
Yeah,
the smell of the flowers, that I don't know for sure from experience. I can't say for sure.
okay. And then Jared would like to know, where can we find the revised coefficient of conservatism list?
Where to find the revised list? Okay, that is a good question. It's not, unfortunately, it hasn't gotten to the point where we can run. We want to publish it, so it is available to everybody. But there's about, I suppose there's at least a dozen to 20 species or so that are unresolved in terms of what the coefficient should be. And there's another thing that really has to be done that's going to take a lot of work before that work is actually done. What I can send you is this. I can send you a list that shows basically what the old list was and what the new coefficient is on the new list. What I'm speaking to is a bigger problem, in that to get the new list really done right, we need to acknowledge all the new species that are now present in Iowa because of taxonomic changes or because of ecological discoveries. In some cases, new species have been discovered that are new relative to the first list came out in 2000, so over 20 years ago. And again, there's just a lot of changes in the flora of Iowa that I would want to have present in anything that's published that shows the revised coefficients. And so, long story short, again, there's a bunch of work that still needs to be done before that can happen. But again, what is done is all of the species that had a coefficient in 2000, I mean, that I can show you. And that's just emailing me and asking for it. And I will send it to you as an Excel file.
All right, well, that's all we have in the chat right now. If anybody wants to unmute or type anything else, but all I see right now.
Well, great. Again, thanks everybody for sticking in. Looks like we got a pretty good number of people yet. So I guess maybe I'll see you. Well, next week we don't meet because I've got 2 presentations to make for another group. So in 2 weeks, right, Lance?
Yep.
It's orchids, right?
Yeah.
All right. Fun group. I'll see you then.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Tom.
Bye.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.